We expect ourselves as leaders and the whole organisation to live by, do the right thing, always seeking to come to work with a desire to improve every day and always putting safety first. The people that can solve these problems are often the people that are closest to the day-to-day work.
What does do the right thing look like to you, and what does it look like to Saffron? I'm interested to see what that means to you.
Shadowing Andrew yesterday. Andrew's a planned maintenance supervisor, so we were looking around a lot of our communal areas. Andrew was explaining to me how we go for a more expensive paint than we necessarily need to in the communal areas because it's the best possible paint we can find that would minimise the spread of flames should a fire occur.
How do you inspire and give confidence to your teams to make sure that they're allowed to do that? Because that's the bigger thing.
My view is that you have to...
James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'm excited for this. We've got a really good subject planned, but as we always like to start, do you mind just by giving us a little introduction to yourself?
Of course I can, James. Yeah, I'm James. I love walking in the mountains. I love running marathons, love supporting Norwich City Football Club, and love spending time with my two teenage daughters. And really, really proud for the last 5 years to have been CEO of Saffron Housing. Real special organisation to me, James, Saffron. I grew up in the heartlands of Saffron's operation, little village called Newton Flotman, just 5 miles down the road from where Saffron is based. So when I went to high school, I used to take a bus from Newton Flotman to Long Stratton every day. And at the high school, I left 30 years ago. Now it's opposite where Saffron's office is today. So it's a little bit personal for me.
I love that. And it probably feeds into the subject that we're going to talk about today, which is kind of that organisational purpose, doing the right thing, all those things, which I know, having talked to you off camera, you're very passionate about. But kind of just let's start the discussion, I suppose, with kind of how you'd summarise Saffron's organisational purpose, I suppose. And then that might feed into kind of us talking about what that means to you as a person, etc.
Of course. I mean, we've been running the organisation for 5 years now with, I guess, a central principle, a central belief that every tenant deserves the best possible service. And I guess let me unpack that for you. I mean, what the ambition of that is, by working on principles, you provide colleagues across the organisation, great colleagues across the organisation, with a framework in which to be empowered and make good decisions based on that purpose. But there's three bits of that, of course: the home, the service, and the every tenant. So it does very much talk to the organisation that Saffron is. Best possible home acknowledges that for a decade the organisation pursued a really clear strategy of development, and that certainly served the organisation very, very well, particularly financially. But it does leave us with a need for a sustained period of investment in improving existing homes. And we recognise that in our overall purpose. I suppose very similar on the best possible service, actually. Back in 2021, if I can take you there, we'd emerged from a period of 42 months outside of being G1. We regained our G1 regulatory grade in 2020. And at that point, we felt we'd earned the right to start talking to tenants about what does service and what does working with Saffron look like for the future. But, we heard some tough messages, real tough messages. We had quite a fragmented and not very effective way of engaging with Saffron if you're a tenant or a member of the community. But we were frequently told a very clear story that tenant A phones up and speaks to colleague A. Colleague A passes that message on or that contact on to colleague B. Colleague B maybe doesn't get back to colleague A or tenant A. So this concept of a vacuum of communication emerged. And therefore, every tenant serving the best possible service was designed specifically to address that. The every tenant, the first two words, symbolises why we exist as an organisation. This is a significant long-term effort to focus the whole organisation on service quality and improving the quality of homes for everybody. And it's interesting. I think that then starts to take you into other principles with which we expect ourselves as leaders and the whole organisation to live by, to do the right thing, as you mentioned, always seeking to come to work with a desire to improve every day and always putting safety first.
Love that. And we'll come back to the do the right thing. But one thing that strikes me, having spoken to you off camera, and also like my team have said about you, is like, you're very, very purpose driven, and you're very, very driven by the community and doing, like we said, doing the right thing and these principles. Where does that come from for you? Is that something to do with the background, or is that something to do with, I don't know, like the way you operate outside of work? Like, I'm keen to understand that, where that comes from, really.
Yeah, I think from a personal perspective, it comes from a number of places, James. You go about your day-to-day work, and we talk at Saffron about living and working in the communities that we operate, and the majority of colleagues at Saffron do exactly that. So there's a real personal accountability that comes with that. I think, we've all been, we've all had periods of our life which have been more challenging, and for me, different relationship breakdowns at different times have caused different periods of time where I have come to just appreciate the sheer platform and foundation, a good quality, loving home can give you. But I think one of the things, when you think back and you start getting asked this question as a leader in terms of where does your values come from, I think this kind of evolves all the time in your head. But as I referenced at the start, as a big Norwich City fan growing up, one of probably the seminal day of my childhood was a football match I went to, which was probably a best forgotten FA Cup semi-final between Norwich and Everton in 1989, which will very, very sadly be remembered for the horrendous Hillsborough disaster. I'd have been, 10 years old at the time. And it had, would it have been a different number have come out of the hat? That could have been us, with Liverpool fans at that game. And I think it had listening to the death toll rise and watching it very, very closely ever since, and the quest for justice that the Liverpool fans and the families of the bereaved went on was inspiring to me. And I think to try and relate that back to the work we do now in housing, obviously we have a significant responsibility for people's safety, tenants and colleagues alike. And I had, I'm not sure whether privilege is the right word, the very profound experience of attending with a board member of ours at Saffron, the Grenfell testimony event earlier this year. And it was an event that was put on by survivors and relatives of the bereaved from Grenfell to directly address the sector and the industry and representatives of that industry that in some way they held responsible for that tragedy. And obviously very, very difficult to listen to, but not nearly as difficult as it would have been to convey that information. And what struck me and what took me right back to the kind of feelings that evoked from growing up and the Hillsborough disaster and what followed was just the sheer courage and the bravery shown by the people that were talking to us in the sector, and the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of justice, and the sheer dignity they showed in the way they approached us. So that was as if I or Saffron needed it, but that was a stark reminder about the weight of responsibility we carry every day, and why safety will always be our top priority at the organisation.
Yeah, I love that. And it's nice. I do think that our lived experiences do shape our leadership skills. When we get to the point of having to lead people, that empathy, that, those value sets generally do come from lived experience, and they do come from our profounder experiences that we have across life, don't they? But the thing that you say, and you've said it 3 or 4 times already, so I really want to pick you up on, is like, what does do the right thing look like to you, and what does it look like to Saffron? I'm interested to see what that means to you.
For me as CEO, if I take that one focus, I think it applies at all levels of the organisation, James, and it has to if the value and the desire is to hold through the organisation. But I think as CEO, you want your character to mean that you gain acceptance for the toughest calls, and those tough calls do come. They don't come every day, but they come periodically. I referenced the fragmented approach to tenant involvement we had in the past. That resulted in myself as CEO advocating something brand new for the sector, which is a Saffron community membership model. It's now 350 people strong. We won hearts and minds in terms of moving to that approach, and it's allowing tenants and members of the community, be them councillors, food bank leads, to contribute to a common purpose. We're all there for the same thing, thriving communities in South Norfolk and beyond. And I think another good example would be creating the role of Chief Tenant Officer at Saffron. So a really clear focus that tenant belonged at the top table, in inverted commas. or indeed, from time to time, you'll take big decisions to protect the long-term financial health of the organisation, and they may well come with impacts for colleagues, and gaining acceptance for those things is what you're aiming for. So I think for me, there's some of the things that would reflect doing the right thing. I think for the board, for the last few years, we've been in a position of increasing rents by CPI plus 1%. The board's always been very explicit that it wants to reserve that 1% and specifically set it aside for measures that would sustain the tenancy, help sustain tenancies for the people most hard hit by that rent increase. So that's the board certainly not doing the easy thing when there's many calls for that money, but doing the right thing. But I think day to day for the majority of people that work for Saffron, it would now be through what we call our service improvement framework. So if I can maybe just take a moment to bring that to life for you. We had one of our involved tenants. She chairs our tenant scrutiny group and is one of our Saffron community members. She came in and shadowed our contact centre, and she noticed that when contacts were coming into Saffron from a tenant, and we were needing to involve a neighbourhood officer in finding a resolution to that contact, frequently the neighbourhood officer wasn't available because, they were working very hard on different pieces of casework. However, that meant that the tenant inquiry wasn't able to be resolved at the first point of contact. And you think, this is interesting. Does that go back to the vacuum? Wonder whether that ever gets resolved. So, service improvement framework pulls everybody around the table: the colleague, the tenant, a senior member of staff that can take a decision to change things. So, as a result of that shadowing, we've created the concept of a duty neighbourhood officer. So, a neighbourhood officer will always be available to take a call from the contact centre. Increasing number of calls being resolved at first point of contact, going some way to start to resolve the vacuum that the tenants had called out very loudly and clearly in 2021. So it's almost it's a real detailed example, but it's almost, there are humble examples of great truths in organisations that go directly to what tenants care about. And it's probably the best example I could give you of doing the right thing. And it involves a lot of listening and hearing.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually as well, like how big of a role as a leader do you have to play to give confidence to your teams to do the right thing? Because the thing about doing the right thing is, as you've said, it's never the easiest thing. So it's never the quickest and it's never the easiest thing. Sometimes it's the path of most resistance that you have to take to do the right thing. How do you inspire and give confidence to your teams to make sure that they're allowed to do that? Because that's the bigger thing.
Yeah, my view is that you have to overtly give permission, sometimes multiple times. I think sometimes people can hear things once and maybe need to hear things 2 or 3 times. So I think it's very important that as leaders, we're very consistent in our message. So when I stand up at our staff conference, which we tend to connect with all colleagues quarterly, but in person once a year, I feel it's very important that I'm consistent in my message. Time and time again, I'm giving permission to speak up. I'm giving permission to make mistakes, because I think what we're trying to do in moving a whole organisation to be tenant focused is that there's a lot of judgment in being tenant focused. So it's trying to move a culture away from binary policy decisions that are inherently, as it was, easier to make and may protect the organisation from a policy perspective, but don't necessarily reflect the nuance. And particularly with consumer regulation coming in, the absolute focus on every tenant in terms of our purpose statement, every tenant's circumstances and therefore solution may be slightly nuanced or different. So what we're trying to do is enable colleagues to apply a judgment to a situation within parameters and guardrails. So I think from a leadership perspective, giving permission, reaffirming permission, that they're not being dire consequences when somebody's tried to do things with good intent and they've gone wrong. A learning culture needs to enable all of those things to happen. It does mean you have to be patient as a leader as well. Sometimes things don't quite happen as quickly as you want them to, particularly when you're trying to change the way you're running an organisation from a very policy-driven approach to a very judgment-based approach. It will take perhaps a little bit longer for people to be able to understand the change that you're going through and be able to get with that change. So I think it requires a lot of things of you as a leader, but perhaps patience above. everything.
I really enjoy speaking to you about this kind of stuff, because actually that comes down to every decision you make, right? So the people you recruit have to be able to want to do it's got to be absolutely systemic in your value set for everyone in the organisation, because you interact with loads of people at staff conferences, but it's your teams and the teams of the teams that are actually interacting with the frontline people that are frontlining off to the tenants and residents. And it's a difficult skill in a big organisation, I think, to get that right.
I think probably, the larger the organisation, the more difficult it becomes. Well, I mean, we sit here at 7,000 homes right now. And interestingly, I had a conversation with a colleague CEO back as we emerged from the pandemic. It was kind of back into 2021 from memory. So, well, I think I've met probably 50% of colleagues this year, and that's not good enough. He'd run something in the organisation he leads, which was called Breakfast With. So we started Breakfast with James. So if you're born in January, you get invited to Breakfast with James in January, and so it goes on through the year. So James gets 12 breakfasts, which is great. I think it's a really good way. So there's no expectation of work chat, but naturally your common purpose is work. So some of the conversation flows there, but it's a really good way of me being able to connect with all colleagues a little bit more socially every year, and just reaffirm some of those messages. And even the act of a modest reward annually, which a breakfast clearly is, I think is just a way of showing that taking this time to talk, to socialise, to get to know each other is really important. And if in some way that gives people a little bit more confidence to do the right thing, or to have a conversation about what doing the right thing means to different people in different roles, then it's certainly been worthwhile.
Yeah, amazing. And we talked a little bit offline, and I think of the word safety and I go straight to the physical. But when we talk about safety taking different forms, can you just expand what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's interesting. As I try and shadow once a month, and shadowing Andrew yesterday. Andrew's a planned maintenance supervisor. So we were looking around a lot of our communal areas in blocks of flats typically. And Andrew was explaining to me how we go for a more expensive paint than we necessarily need to in the communal areas, because it's the best possible paint we can find that would minimise the spread of flames should a fire occur in a communal area. So therefore giving the best chance for tenants and any leaseholders to be able to evacuate without sustaining, minimising any risk or harm to them. So I think on one level I think that's part of empowerment. I had no idea that was happening until I went out yesterday. So clearly there's been an empowerment that said, from a value for money perspective, it's right to spend more money on paint to promote that level of safety. And we didn't need to do that. So that was really good to hear. But I think, people will often think about safety quite rightly as property safety. And we certainly have a zero tolerance to being, non-compliant in any of those areas. But I think, James, from my perspective, it goes much beyond that. And I guess this is partly influenced by, say, some of the things I've talked about that are important to me from over the years and growing up. But we've had a really big focus on domestic abuse over the last probably 18 months or so now at Saffron. We're going for our domestic abuse accreditation. So all colleagues in Saffron have been through some very bespoke domestic abuse and domestic violence training. That's been very, very challenging for many people. There's also something about psychological safety that's increasingly important in creating an empowered organisation that does the right thing. And that is people having the ability to speak up. If they want something, me to do more of something or me to do less of something, I kind of think I failed if people aren't able to tell me that. But that, of course, relies on them feeling psychologically safe to do so. So we spend a lot of time as a senior leadership team on psychological safety. We've run a session as a board recently where we've been able to call each other out on things, which again is really, really important to get to that kind of level of high performance on support and challenge that moves the organisation forward. So lots going on, and we're very much promoting that through our managers group across the entire organisation. So the people that can solve these problems are often the people that are closest to the day-to-day work. So unless we're creating that psychological safety, I think it's easy to see safety as this kind of thing over here that's very important but not connected. But I think by promoting and creating that level of psychological safety, not only do people feel safe, but you start to get the best ideas percolating up into the improvement framework.
I was going to say that actually, yeah. I mean, what have been some of the symptoms you've seen across Saffron in that? Has it just been a much more open, dynamic culture? Has it been that you've started to see, big change in the organisation? Like, what have been some of the symptoms you've seen from some of that safety stuff that you've implemented?
Yeah, but I mean, I think there was a period a couple of years ago when I think one of my little informal KPIs to myself is the amount of time it takes me to hear about anything that I feel is kind of really important to our critical path. And it was taking a little bit too long for my liking. So I guess people's sense of what was really important wasn't quite where we wanted it to be, and that started to change. And if I'm walking through the office, James, Terry, our electrician the other day, James, come and look at this. We're doing some great work in terms of educating. Yeah, that's probably the right word. Educating and informing, raising the level of awareness about how to work with a smoke alarm in a house. And around about 50 tenants came through a kind of a caravan we had set up in the car park to the office, probably 2 or 3 weeks ago. And again, really good example of something through that empowerment, somebody being able to just get on and do something that could have a significant impact on somebody's life, ultimately, through just a little bit more awareness and a little bit of training. So, yeah, little examples like that, James, where you just see things happening that make you very, very proud. And I think it's then incumbent on you as the leader of the organisation to call them out in a very positive way and celebrate them as, that's a successful thing that we've done and well done.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I mean, these things are always a journey, right? But I'm always interested to see what's left of these situations. So, like, what still needs to be done for you to continue on that journey for Saffron to promote safety, but also promote doing the right thing? What is left to do, do you think, that you still want to see?
This probably fits with how does health and safety fit with our wider strategy as an organisation. So if you think about health and safety as that's the risk appetite, that's base camp. We don't do anything else until we've done that. But we have, when I talked about best possible service, we've got an aspiration by 2030 to be over 90% on tenant satisfaction, the best barometer of service at the moment. We have an aspiration for all of our homes to be at least at EPC category C or above by 2030. So our best barometer at the moment of the quality of homes, but we're not there. So one in 4 tenants are not satisfied with Saffron at the moment. One in 3 of our homes is not at that level of quality. So we've got a lot to move to improve satisfaction to improve service to a level where satisfaction is constantly starting with a 9. At the same time as being able to invest more and more in existing home is a challenge, because it means you're doing better for less, because you're trying to free up money to put into investing in improving homes. And I think, but by way of example on that, 5 years ago, we were investing 10 pennies of every pound of rent in improving existing homes, 10 pence. This year, it'll be 25 pence. By 2028, it needs to be 33 pence. And that's just to get to EPC category C or better. That's a legal requirement. We've got to do it. It is very, very interesting. And I think herein lies some of the kind of what keeps me up awake at the moment. When you think about what tenants want, and when regulatory tenant satisfaction measures are coming through, which are all about the feel from a tenant, tenants are more concerned about how long they've had a kitchen or how long they've had a bathroom or the visual quality of the estate or the neighbourhood environment than they are on EPCC measures. So we've got quite a tension or a trade-off call that we're having to make actually in pursuit of what is ultimately an environmental efficiency and improvement in a house for very good environmental reasons. However, what we're not able to prioritise are the things that tenants are telling us are most important to them. So that's a really difficult spot at a point where you're trying to create this amount of investment to go into existing homes. So I think it's a challenge that it's very important we articulate as well to government, and so that we could. I think I would want to be in a position to explain very clearly just how hard we're working to do what we're doing. So I think we need to position ourselves as organisations, as a sector, as self-deterministic, optimising value for money, and then we earn the right, hopefully, to a supportive government to be able to do more if we can make the social and economic case for doing that. But I think within that, things like understanding the nuance of where, legal goals like EPCC by 2030 are there for the right reasons, but compromising our ability to do things and improve the quality of external appearance of estates and put kitchens and bathrooms in more quickly. It's really important that we're clear about that. And that's not a choice we're making for any other reason, that we're prioritising different objectives and legal requirements.
And is this, I'm really for it actually, but there's been a real rise in customer voice roles, head of customer insight report roles. Like there's been a lot of that. And I think getting customers more in tune with our organisations is only going to benefit what the needs of those customers are, right? But also that's quite an interesting subject matter, is that there's things we have to do legally and then there's things that we'd like to do. How do you speak to customers and how do you get them involved in some of this stuff so that they can understand and be educated? Not love the word educated, but how they can understand kind of why these things need to take place, and therefore there's going to be an offset somewhere else by the need to get all of our properties to EPC. Because like you say, it's not people's priority at the moment. That's not what they want. They want a nicer home. They want a warmer home. How do you solve that challenge?
It's a very difficult challenge to solve, but I think in terms of being informed by a tenant voice, I stood on stage with one of our. We have three board member spots of a board of 12 reserved for people with direct lived experience, and one of those board members stood with me on stage at a conference just last week, and we spoke together. We've been fortunate enough to achieve a C1 consumer regulation grade in a recent inspection, so we were talking about some of the progress we've made and some of the plans we've still got for the future as part of that. And what my board member colleague articulated very clearly was a sort of a move. We've done a lot in Saffron. You said we did. So tenant feedback said X, we've done Y to respond to that. And what we're trying to do in terms of kind of insight to action, we would call it. It's all taking all different forms of insight. So from the voice of tenants directly, through complaints, through inbound calls, through colleagues relaying that information to us, to our formal tenant group. So we have a tenant scrutiny group, we have a tenant communications group, both of whom feed up to our service quality committee. Organisationally, we use the phrase insight to action. So it's rather than going, right, you said we did, that's well intended, but could be slightly scattergun. It's trying to take all of those different pieces of insight. So we're hearing from as wider and as diverse a set of voices as we possibly can, and then think, well, what's that telling us? And before we go and then do something, either based on our idea, terrible, or based on what we think we're hearing, not quite as bad, but not optimum, is then play that back to tenants. This is what we're thinking. Does this feel right? So I suppose it's our way of starting to move towards co-production. I think we're still in the earlier stages of trying to understand what that means in practical terms for the organisation. But our service improvement framework gives us a good ability to test, to pilot some of that. And we've just run some work on an alterations policy where tenants may want to make some changes to their home at their expense, but need to request permission for Saffron. It's been a really difficult journey for us, but we've involved tenants. We've recently met with our service quality committee to decide some of that, and we've got a little bit more work to do before we get it right. But I think it's our first example of genuinely trying to co-produce something. And it's not easy. It takes longer, but hopefully if you do it once and you do it right, it then sticks for the long term. And that's the intent.
Love that. I was just thinking when you said co-production, we both got teenage girls, I think you said at the beginning. Trying to co-produce anything with my teenage girl is difficult. So I imagine it's just as difficult in all the other elements of what you do. And look, we've run out of time, but I did want to just get one final thing across, which was I'd love to get your view on what's next for you. Like, I just get this overwhelming passion that you have for Saffron as an organisation. Maybe it's because that's where you grew up. Maybe it's because you feel like you've got the Norwich Football Club job in your own sector type thing. But what do you still want to achieve at Saffron, and what would you love to happen in the next 3 to 5 years at the business so that you can look back and be really proud of your achievements there in the role?
Yeah, to 2030 is really key for the way I look at Saffron, James. If we can get to a position of having tenant satisfaction of at least 90% consistently, 2030 represents something of a milestone rather than a destination on homes. That's that's an evolving view. As you go out and see things, you realise EPCC plus is going to be a very difficult thing to achieve, but it's not the destination. That's an important environmental milestone, but there's going to be a lot to do beyond that. So 2030 is about hitting that milestone, setting up the organisation with the investment capacity to go again beyond that and tackle a lot more of the things that need doing to improve the quality of estates, void standards, kitchens, bathrooms. But with that, I think if you've got by that stage 90% plus on tenant satisfaction, that would be an indication that we've got trust, we've inspired trust of tenants. And then I think at that point, the conversation does become more adult to adult, if you like, in terms of, well, no, we can't do that now, but actually we can be very clear. We can do it in 2032 or it's 2034. I think from my perspective, that level of, we don't live in a certain world. I'm not sure certainty is ever going to exist, but we can get absolute clarity for people on what our intention is and be very clear if there are good reasons why we are not able to do that.
Yeah, no, I love that. Honestly, it's been this is why I love doing the podcast, is that I love shining a light on organisations and what they stand for and what they do. But yours is really, really close to my heart around actually creating that safe space for people to perform at their best, but also to do the right thing by customers. And that doesn't really matter if we're in housing or other sectors. I think it's more relevant in housing because of how much impact we can have on someone's life in the sector that we work in. But I really appreciate you sharing your insights, James. And honestly, I think people are going to get great value from this episode.
Great. Very much hope so. Thanks for taking the time, James.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Hip. If you'd like to hear more from us, please be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast platform. We are also running a 30-minute clinic free of charge to any clients that want to recruit in a more inclusive way. For more information, please reach out to us on our website, andersonjames.com.